My daughter had me sign a paper the day after her husband lost his job. She told me it was a routine bank form, just an update, nothing to worry about. She sat across from me at the kitchen table with a mug of coffee that she said she made herself, and she smiled in the way people do when they want you to stop asking questions. After I had signed, she folded the paper and said, "There, that's done." She hid the rest of it in her purse and later told the bank the signature was theirs to use. 2 weeks later, when she wanted the title transferred on my little house so she could secure a loan for the renovation of her own, she called me and said I had no choice, that I'd already handed it over. That's the betrayal. My daughter, who I raised and who told me I was the only one who knew how to keep the family together, used my trust like a pawn. She turned my hands into a convenience for her life, and then, when it suited her, called me incapable, difficult, someone the family could point at when things went wrong. It hurt because I had given everything, time, money, patience, into the life around me, and they used that very willingness as permission to take more. I'll say up front who they were. My daughter Claire, my son Mark, Claire's husband Aaron, my younger sister Evelyn, who always liked to act like she knew better, and a lawyer they hired who was new to the kind of quiet small town estates you think move slowly. He moved fast. Unkind people can be neat in how they remove you from things. They were neat. I wasn't a child, helpless. I was 68, living in the house I'd lived in for 40 years. It was modest, 3 bedrooms, a sagging porch with a swing my father had built, a garden I kept for tomatoes and sunflowers. I'd worked at the grocery store down the road for 20 years, then the pharmacy for 10, then part-time until I was tired and retired. Money was never plentiful, but it wasn't the problem. The problem was that when illness and misfortune came to 2 of them, my willingness to be flexible became a lever. There was a power imbalance rooted in dependency and fear. Claire and Mark had mortgages, children, student loans. Aaron lost his job one winter and was ashamed to tell his father. He turned to Claire. Mark had been laid off in a round of cuts and started showing up on my porch because he couldn't bear telling his wife they were behind on their payments. I helped. I let Mark borrow money. I let Claire use the house for quiet afternoons when the children were sick. I watched my grandchildren after school because daycare costs were crushing. I signed the occasional paper when they said the bank needed an account, linked, or a proof of ownership to refinance. I believed them because I wanted to believe family is a thing that protects its own. The logistics of why I couldn't simply pack up and leave were concrete and dull. My Social Security income was fixed. I had small savings, not enough to buy a new place or rent for long in the town where rising prices made new beginnings expensive. My back ached from years of standing on my feet. My hip occasionally let me down. My name was on the deed of the house. Over the years, I had let them file minor things with the bank, set up a joint account when Claire promised it was merely for paying utilities. I had thought a joint account would make life easier. I had thought family would be family. Those small, practical arrangements gave them the means to push when they needed to. It began with small misdirections. Claire would call and say, "The bank asks for a notarized statement. Can you come in next week?" I'd go. Mark would ring and say, "Ma, do you mind giving me a check? I'll pay you back." I wrote checks I could afford, and then sometimes they didn't get paid back. Aaron would mention casually at the supper table that he needed the house's equity to secure a line of credit. I would say no. He would explain the benefit, We'll fix the porch, we'll do up the kitchen, you'll have a nicer place to live. They always painted it as an improvement for me, as if turning over the little security I had was a favor. Then the escalation loops began, small and frequent. First, exclusion. I arrived one afternoon to find boxes moving out of the spare room. Claire met me on the porch and said she was clearing out some of her things because the mortgage company wanted to see the room empty to appraise the house. She'd arranged for a neighbor to come and help. She didn't mention that she had already listed the house as a co-owner for a loan. When I asked, she bristled and told me I was being difficult for no reason. My reaction was to ask more questions. That made them lean in with pressure. They began to call me forgetful in front of the grandchildren, joking. They started to tell their friends that I had a hard time handling money. It was subtle humiliation, words that fit in the mouths of people who wanted to make me feel small without appearing cruel. A friend of Mark's asked Mark at a BBQ if I still remembered to take my medication. Mark laughed. Claire laughed. I felt foolish, then angry. The consequence was immediate. Neighbours who had always greeted me started asking Claire or Mark about the house instead of me. Invitations that once flowed to my porch stopped. Next came the financial pressure. They convinced the bank that they needed access to my account for convenience. And the bank, being practical and not judgmental, set up a joint control after seeing the paperwork Claire provided. At first, they used it to pay utilities and, as they said, to maintain the property. Then they pulled funds citing emergencies, a broken down car, medical bills, a tuition payment. I protested. I called the bank, and the banker told me the paperwork was in order. I could get a new account, he said, but by then my small cushion had been chipped away. I tried to stop it. I went to the town clerk and asked what I needed to revoke a joint account. They told me forms and waiting periods, a trough of bureaucracy I was not equipped to swim in. The lawyer they'd hired, the new one, advised that it was easier to refinance and restructure with my cooperation. He called me in the kitchen one morning, all soft-spoken, and said, "Mrs. Clark, considering your health and the ease of the transaction, it would be kinder if you allowed Claire the signature authority." He smiled like someone who believed kindness was a legal strategy. I left with pamphlets and promises and a feeling I couldn't name. There was humiliation at family gatherings. I used to host Christmas with my mother's old table and mismatched chairs. After the joint account was set up, Claire began to plan everything. She changed the menu, the timing, the guest list. When I asked about my old family photos on the mantle, she moved them to a drawer for safety. I watched my childhood slip sideways. Someone made a joke. She's sentimental. Let her keep one or two things. The laughter coiled around me. I felt foolish and then I felt excluded. The consequence was a sense of being unmoored in my own life. The situation worsened by degrees. More items packed away, more decisions made without asking me. They used my reputation against me. You get labeled a certain way and people begin to act upon it. Mark once said, not to me, but within earshot, "It's taxing to manage mum. You get a lot of repetition. She wants things the way they used to be." That was code. It meant I was a problem that needed managing. It meant they could manage me. In practical terms, it meant more forms signed, more updates to my accounts, more nights I'd wake up to the feeling of someone having moved something vital and not telling me. Then the betrayal deepened into a lie. The power of attorney Claire produced from a local notary listed her as my agent for all financial matters, signed with my name in a hand that matched mine. I had not signed that document. I still had the grocery list I'd written that morning in my handwriting, the coffee stain on the corner. But the document in the lawyer's file had my name and a date I knew I did not sign. I asked Aaron about it. He said he'd taken me to the lawyer last month and I must not remember. When I tried to press, Claire, with a tired sigh, said I'd always been forgetful and that they were only trying to help. I reacted by ripping up a few papers at the kitchen table. I shouted at the air because who else was there to shout at? Their consequence was swift. I was labelled unstable. Evelyn called and said, with that usual clinical tone, that perhaps I should see a doctor, just to be safe. Friends called less. The bank filed paperwork to formalise everything. The situation got worse. My independent bank cards were frozen temporarily for security reasons, and I had to ask for help from the post office just to collect my mail because the bank insisted identification match their new records. They used exclusion again, harder. They organised a family meeting at the house and did not tell me. I found out because my neighbour, Mrs. Roach, saw them and mentioned the cookies Claire had brought. I stood on the porch and listened to their laughter through the glass, and I had to go inside because it felt like a theft I could not publicly call theft. Because I had been the one everyone pointed to when things went wrong, the scapegoat. I couldn't be believed easily. Margaret overreacts, someone would say, and the circle would tighten. Each time something changed, it was for the worse. One day, the electric company sent a notice about unpaid bills. Claire called and said, "I've paid them, Ma. Don't worry." The next week, when I reminded her that I'd heard back that they were paid, she said, "We take care of that now. You don't need to." The consequence was that I started to feel like a child whose presence behind the curtain had been erased. The house became quieter in the way that only happens when other people own the reasons for the noise. They used manipulation in a small, poisonous way. They offered me small kindnesses, a takeout dinner, a ride to church, a lawn cut. And then, without explanation, they would take away privileges like the spare car I had used or access to the attic where my late husband's tools were. They would say, "We're doing this for your safety," but the safety was theirs. Keeping themselves from a scene, from an awkward conversation, from being asked to account for where the money went. Humiliation came publicly. I remember the day when Claire told one of my friends, softly, in front of me, that I'd had a misstep with the medication dosage. I had made a mistake. I had picked up the wrong bottle once. We all make mistakes. But by telling it to my friend in that careful way, she made me into a spectacle. The consequence, word spread. My neighbours began to exchange looks that implied I might not be as sharp as I once was. That look follows you until it becomes a shield against kindness. When the pressure mounted, I tried to fight by myself, and then with people who should have been impartial. I called the county helpline for elder assistance. They were helpful, but the bureaucrats move at a pace older bones don't appreciate. They told me to collect documents. I called my sister Evelyn, who had always enjoyed the role of the sensible one. She came by, looked over papers, and with a small smile, told me I should give them the benefit of the doubt. "You don't want to cause trouble, Margaret," she said. She was not cruel. She was protective of her own sense of order. It felt like betrayal. The escalation sharpened when Aaron began to use the house for business without telling me. He turned the garage into a small workshop and used my address as the business address on Craigslist. I discovered it when strangers came asking about a repaired lawnmower. I was embarrassed. My reaction was to insist he clean up and stop using my address. He said with the same half smile that was now a family tactic, "We're building something for the family." The consequence was a complaint from the town inspector for an unlicensed business on a residential lot. I had to appear at a meeting and explain myself. I left with paper cuts from the papers they handed me and a heavier feeling that the ground beneath me was shifting. It gets worse before it gets worse. The pivotal low point is not a single dramatic scene, it is accumulation. But there was a night that felt like an ending. I came home from the pharmacy with a bag and the little lamp I always kept beside my chair. The front door was unlocked. The house smelled of bleach. They had been in. Someone had boxed up my mother's china and the photo albums with the children's first teeth and the letters my husband had written from his first job overseas. My heart, which had learned the slow, patient rhythms of small disasters, stuttered. I went to Claire's as quietly as I could because confrontation had become expensive, and I asked where they had put those things. She listened with a practiced calm and said, "We put them somewhere safe." I asked where that was. She looked past me and said, "You don't need them where you are. It's just stuff." That was the low point. Not the box, not the china. It was the way my life had been turned into stuff to manage. The humiliation of being told the tangible evidence of my past could be separated from me as if I were not part of that past. In that quiet moment, surrounded by absence, I felt abandoned. My leverage, the fact that I was the title holder, the person with the original signatures, had been reduced by smoke and mirrors. My bank cards were unreliable. My voice was marginalized in family conversations. I was beaten down by being made to feel small, inconvenient, and the cause of their stress. For a while after that night, I did nothing. I sat in my living room and let the clock tick, and I thought of the way the swing on the porch used to creak when my husband and I would talk about nothing at all. I considered whether to move out, to sell the house, to let go entirely. Financially, it would have been difficult. Emotionally, it felt like admitting defeat. The worst part was the solitude. When you've been made the family scapegoat, you lose more than possessions. You lose the presumption of being believed. Then one small mistake opened a window. Claire, under pressure, and I suspect sleepless, made a routine error with a bank form. She presented a scanned copy of the deed to the bank for the refinance, but the scan included, faintly in the corner, a page I recognized as the back of a letter from my mother dated decades ago. Someone at the bank flagged the inconsistency and put a hold on the transfer. The hold meant they needed me to come in to sign in person for the transfer to be valid. This was the trigger. Not a confession, not a monumental discovery, but a bureaucratic pause that required me to be present. I took my time. I did not rush in like a woman who felt sure. I moved deliberately, and I took a stack of papers I had not thought to bring for months. The original deed from 1991 with my signature, a series of receipts for mortgage payments in the 90s, and a letter my mother had written and sealed before she died in 2002. I had kept that letter because its edges had been chewed by rain and because it smelled faintly of lavender. It was the sort of thing people keep for themselves. I found it in a shoebox in the attic. When the bank called me in to resolve the hold, Claire expected resistance. Or at least, I think she expected me to be a blur who could be coaxed. She was surprised to see me arrive with the deed and the letter. I opened the letter in the bank's small room and read out loud, because the banks always want a record. My mother had written that the house was to remain in my name unless I deemed otherwise. Not a grand bequest of riches, mind you, but clear. My mother named me as the steward. She said she trusted me. The bank official swallowed and took notes. The hold on the transfer revealed a truth. Papers matter. The bank could halt a transfer when a document did not look right. The lawyer they had hired had been confident. For a while, it seemed he had the authority. But the paper trail, the little seeds of time, were stubborn. They showed up. The bank required identification and signature matching and proof of recent activity. Because of the hold, Claire could not push the refinance through without me. She realized, with a small panic, that her window had closed and that their ability to move the title had been damaged. There was no grand confession. What happened instead were small unveilings. When I insisted on copies of the bank forms, the bank handed me a stack that showed a signature I did not recognize on the power of attorney. Only it had been notarized by a notary who had a known reputation for being sloppy. When I took the paperwork to the county clerk and asked for the public record, the clerk, a woman who had seen too many family disputes, told me that the notary had been disciplined 2 years before for notarizing documents without verifying signatures. The sequence was simple: a notary's neglect, a misplaced scan, a bank hold. The error did what secrets seldom do. It made them visible. I did not make a speech. I did not declare war. I went to the lawyer with the papers and, with my voice steady, asked for an explanation. He was flummoxed for a breath, then attempted to say it was an oversight. Claire grew cold and defensive. Mark tried to charm me into letting him sort it out. Aaron paced. Evelyn pretended to be above it all. They each offered small, practical overtures. We can write you a check. We'll move the papers back. Let's just fix the problem without fuss. I could have signed and let them refinance. Doing so would have smoothed things and given them the money and likely returned me to my former place of cooperative mother. But the turning point was not merely discovering that their actions hinged on documents they thought they controlled. The turning point for me was a small, private decision. I decided I would not be the safety net again. In that quiet space, I realized that their use of my generosity had not been a partnership, it had been a strategy. I told them no. I said it plainly to Claire in the kitchen, to the lawyer in his office, to Mark in the driveway. I said, no, I will not sign. I expected pleading, bargaining, a limpet of guilt that might nudge them. Instead, I got a mix of anger and surprise. Claire's face hardened. Mark accused me of being selfish. Evelyn said, "You'll regret this." Aaron said nothing. His silence spoke a tiredness I recognized. The consequence was immediate. The refinance stalled entirely. They could not pull the equity out without my cooperation. There were practical effects. Mark's car payments bounced. Aaron had to stall his plans. Claire, who had been counting on an infusion of cash for their kitchen remodel, had to delay. They were angry and they tried to persuade me with pleas and explanations. They tried to make me feel safe in exchange for compliance. They offered money for my silence. They said the quiet thing. Everyone who has convenience on their side says, we're doing what's best for everyone. I insisted on a proper accounting. I asked for a receipt for every penny they had taken from the joint account over the past year. I went to the county mediator and asked for a meeting to sort out the notary's negligence and the bank's role. I wrote letters because sometimes writing places you on record. When no one provided all the receipts, I went to the bank and requested the transaction history for the joint account. It was dull work. Forms, waiting, the smell of printer ink, but the details were a map. The history showed transfers to names I did not recognize, cash withdrawals that were large and unspecific, payments to contractors with little record. It was not dramatic. It was a ledger that did what ledgers do. It refused to stay silent. They tried to spin it into reconciliation. Claire said she would repay. Mark said it was an investment in their future, but there was no full accounting, and I would not close my eyes. The logical, real consequence of refusing to sign was that the household they had built on my name was incomplete without me. They could not draw from the equity. They could not liquidate what they had counted on. So they began to hustle, to find other ways. Friends offered loans at high interest. Aaron took odd jobs. Mark mowed lawns. The family was forced to take responsibility for their miscalculations instead of making mine cover them. There was no dramatic courtroom scene. There was a practical shrinkage of their options. The bakery down the street, where they often ran tabs, refused large orders because creditors had become wary. Friends who had been generous withdrew small favours because they too felt named by association. In short, their safety net frayed. The outcome wasn't spectacular. It was a grinding correction. Life got harder for them in the way consequences do when they are real, quietly, over time, in bills that arrived and late fees and the necessity to account. As for me, I did not take back everything. I did not rescind the help I had given. I took some actions to protect what I had left. I opened a new account under my name only at a different bank. I changed passwords. I stored legal documents in a safety deposit box and had the county clerk help me verify identities on future notarizations. I moved the photo albums back onto the mantle myself, and I took down the list of chores Claire had posted on the fridge and stuck my own note beneath it. Ask me first. There were costs. Relationships frayed. Claire cut me off on social media. Mark delivered my mail less frequently. Evelyn stopped coming by as often. The grandchildren were cautioned to be careful about what they said. I lost the ease of being included, but I did not lose my name. I did not lose the sense that I could decide. The long-term consequences were realistic. They had to learn to live without the convenient access to my resources. In the months that followed, I watched them shift. Mark took a job at a distribution centre with early hours. Aaron took on landscaping gigs he hated but could do. Claire started teaching one evening class. They tightened their spending. There were arguments, shortages, and a few nights of fast food dinners in the car because gasoline was cheaper than takeout. There was also a reckoning. When you cannot rely on the kindness of one person to solve structural problems, you either change your structure or you pay the cost. For me, the consequences were quieter but steadier. I had less anxiety in the tiny spaces of the day where fear had lived. I could check my bank account without surprise. I could have a friend over without the worry. that someone would call to justify a decision. I still sent birthday gifts to my grandchildren. I still loved my daughter. Refusing to be a safety net did not mean I burned bridges. It meant I set a limit. There were messy conversations. Claire confronted me one afternoon and said, "How could you do this to us?" I told her the truth in as few words as possible. I refused to be used. She said I had no idea how hard it had been. I said I did. She cried because she could not open the loan window she thought she had. Mark shouted. Aaron looked at the floor. Evelyn said, without much warmth, that she was disappointed. The family fractured more than it had been because fractures were what had been growing inside for a long time, waiting for pressure. In the months that followed, a middle ground formed. It was not reconciliation in the rosy sense. It was an arrangement. They came by with coffee sometimes. I read to my granddaughter once a week. Claire called on holidays. We did not mention the joint account. We agreed to keep things practical. We negotiated the chores differently. I let them visit without assuming they would dictate the terms. It was not perfect. It was not meant to be. The final practical fallout came when the notary was disciplined and 2 of the transactions were reversed after a quiet investigation by the bank. There was no criminal trial. The result was bureaucratic and slow. A repayment plan, a tightening of the bank's oversight, and an admonition to the lawyer who had prepared documents without sufficient verification. That was all. There were no heroic wins. There were small corrections that made the ledger look more like what it should have. Emotionally, I felt lighter, though not unscarred. The key shift was that I stopped being the person everyone assumed would absorb the cost of other people's failures. The power balance changed because I chose to change it. I chose to say no. That decision was not dramatic. It was practical. It was the same quiet voice I had used all my life when sorting disputes, except for once, I used it to refuse myself being flattened. If you ask whether I regret the years I gave, the nights I woke for a sick child, the money I lent, I would say no. Help had been given because it needed giving. Where I regret is in thinking help was the same thing as surrender. They took advantage of my willingness. That is a different thing from helping. I could have asked for receipts earlier. I could have kept better boundaries. Hindsight is crisp and cold. But hindsight is not a plan. It is an observation. Now, when I sit on my porch swing in the afternoon, I watch the children play on the street. I water the sunflowers. I talk to my neighbours. Life is quieter and less complicated in the way of a bowl with fewer things in it. Simple and honest. Occasionally, Claire stops by and we talk about the grandchildren. She asks how things are at the house. I tell her. We keep the conversations short. They are not warm in the old way, but they are not poisonous either. I have space. I don't know if our family will be mended in any grand sense. Families are not repaired with a single tool. They rearrange. People change. Sometimes distance helps the wound. Scab. Sometimes it doesn't. What matters at the end of long things like this is not that you proved a point. It's that you can live with the outcome you create. If this story meant something to you, I'd appreciate a like. If you'd like to hear more, you can subscribe. Have you ever been in a situation where people assumed you would always be the one to give? I'd be curious to hear about it in the comments.